walked up to his bed and I pointed the gun at my father's head and I squeezed the trigger. And I immediately lifted the gun where I knew my mother's head was. I couldn't see it anymore because the flash had blinded me, but I knew where it was. And I squeezed the trigger again. And I laughed. I giggled hysterically.
Hi guys, thank you for clicking onto my video. My name's Emily. Now today's case is of a teen who was sentenced to death for the murder of his own parents. Now let's just jump into it. Sean Sellers was born on the 18th of May 1969. He lived at home with his mother and stepfather. They lived in Oklahoma City at the time. When Sean was little, he was described as quite docile, sweet, but very mild-mannered, and he always had a smile on his face. Sean was also very smart and he excelled academically. But at the age of 6, he reportedly started hearing voices, although he never said anything to anyone, believing that everyone heard voices as well. Vonda had Sean at a very young age. She was only 16 years old when she gave birth to him. However, his dad, on the other hand, had a serious drinking problem which led his mum and his dad to split up when Sean was just 3 years old. She raised him for a few years until she got into a relationship with truck driver Paul Belafetto. They had gotten married, to which he then became Sean's stepdad. His life wasn't exactly the easiest though. His mother and his stepfather worked a hell of a lot after Vonda had taken up trucking with Paul. So Sean was often left with other family members. But instead of feeling loved and cared for, they had hurt and humiliated him. It was reported that his grandfather used to beat him, and one of his uncles used to make him wear nappies when he was like 12, 13 years old because he used to wet the bed. And if he had wet the bed 2 nights in a row, this uncle used to make him wear this soiled nappy on his head. Also, I'm not too sure if this was the same uncle or not, but his grandfather and one of his uncles took him out shooting and showed him how to kill animals. He was made to shoot a deer, and at first Sean refused until they ridiculed him by calling him a wimp. Sean caved into the pressure and pulled the trigger, but they weren't done there, and they showed him how to handle the body, and they pulled him up by his hind legs, cut his genitals off and disemboweled it. His uncle didn't stop, and he went on to show Sean how to decapitate a wounded raccoon. He embedded an axe into its head and pulled its legs until its head came off. What the fuck? I know there's no manual for raising kids, but was you raised by wolves? It had been reported that Sean had been sexually abused when he was younger, although Sean's stepsister believes that these accusations weren't true. Sean would go through huge mood swings, and just to give you a little insight, on one of the incidences, Sean had been caught having pushed a pencil up his penis and slammed it into the window. For 1, ouch, and 2, he was only a child when doing this, so my question is, what had happened to him for him to do something like this? In my opinion, it backs up his sexual abuse claims, because never in my life have I ever come across a child that mentions anything like this without being exposed to sexual abuse themselves. After some time of his granddad taking care of him, it had all gotten too much and he had stopped taking Sean, but his parents still had to go to work, and they had to get a babysitter in to take care of Sean while they was out on the road. This was probably the worst mistake that they could have made, because at the age of 10, Sean's babysitter had brought over some books, and not just any books, they were books on satanic practice. On an adolescent mind, that would have had some serious effect on his thought trait. At that age, you're so impressionable. He was very curious and started reading them with his babysitter, but his mum had found out and hit the roof, and she had said to the babysitter, if you ever do this again, you won't have a job here. But by then, it was too late, and at the age of 15, he was fully obsessed, and that year, he was introduced to a witch.
Then at 15, I got introduced to a witch, and she took me in as her disciple and taught me for a while, and got me involved in Satanism. She had a piece of human skin where she was witness to a human sacrifice. Her first words to me was, well, you can go white magic or you can go black magic. White magic is kind of hypocritical, but if you want power, you go black magic. And so I said, okay, let's go black magic. And she said the first thing you have to do is pray to Satan.
He was so interested in satanic rituals that he practiced them every day. He even drank his own blood, which he stored in the fridge and took into school, sometimes freaking out the other kids drinking it in front of them. He also had a deep interest in the board game Dungeons and Dragons. Now at this point, society had deemed this game for the devil, and most parents had stopped their children playing it. I honestly think this was just a cop-out. I get it for the time and era it was, but I still think it was a cop-out. With his parents hardly around, he could play it and get lost in his own fantasy. And the reason why he was so into his own world is because by the time he was 16 years old, his mum had moved him 30 times. He had been pushed from pillar to post, going to and from his parents and his aunties, and they lived in different states. So he learned that there was just no point in making friends because he'd just be ripped away from them anyway. This was also around the time where he started having dreams about killing his mother and stepfather, but he couldn't do this alone. And he started asking demons to enter his body to give him the power to do so. The nutcase would frequently ask demons to enter his body. Like, dude, 101 of ghosts and demons. Do not allow them to enter your body. He claimed he was then possessed by the demon Ezerite, who in demonology is known as a human turned demon. She is described as a laid-back trickster. But the reason why she became a demon is because when she was a little girl, her village had been attacked by a corrupt military. But her and her brother was in the nearby woods, and they had actually ran because their parents had been killed. But somehow they lost each other. When the attack had finished, she went to look for her brother, but she so happened to walk into the house of a demonic scientist. He had offered her a bed to stay in for as long as she wanted, but it wasn't free and she had to work for him, which is only fair really. But a few years later, she accidentally knocked over one of his experiments. But this particular experiment was supposed to give demonic powers to anyone who already wasn't demonic. This caused a huge explosion and the little girl had died. But the demonic scientist's experiment actually ended up working and she came back as a demon. Her physical appearance had changed, but she was able to appear normal when she wanted to. She had grown a thin black tail that had split off into two prongs a few inches from the end, with red lips that merged into the darkness. Her eye colour had also changed, going from a blue to a much lighter looking grey almost, which actually changed when she got angry to black eyes and red pupils. All of her teeth, ears and nails appeared to be pointed, and when she became a demon, she was able to control blood, to the point she was actually able to make weapons out of it. She was also able to control the limbs of humans and the body of animals, and when she did it, she almost looked like she was playing the piano. However, Sean had claimed that this was the demon that had possessed him. He had got that deep into Satanism that he and his best friend Richard had taken it to the next step. They had become friends because Richard and Sean had similar interests. They had become thick as thieves. They spent most days with each other practicing satanic rituals. And just to prove to each other that they were blood brothers, in an abandoned farmhouse they drank each other's blood. The blood brothers then proceeded to get worse, and in September of 1985 they had made a decision to go into a gas station called Circle K. They had attempted to get beer, which at the time the shop attendant Robert Bower had refused them because they were clearly 16 years old. So Robert had asked them for ID, but when they didn't produce one, he kicked them both out. Both teens were pissed and they vowed to get their revenge. The following week, Sean said that they needed to show Satan that they meant business and that maybe he would give them the power that he was so desperately looking for. Richard had stolen a .357 Magnum from his grandfather and gave it to Sean. They then both went into Circle K.
As I replay, I've seen it over and over again. I used to have nightmares over and over again seeing this. But as he looked into my eyes, I know that he saw what was fixing to happen. And he realized that, hey, I know these kids. They can identify me. I can identify them. They're not here to rob me, you know? And he took off running that way. Richard came up from the back and got in front of the counter. He slipped and fell just as I fired again, and it grazed his shoulder. I heard him scream, so I thought I got him. Richard and I traded places. He was running back and forth behind the counter. Richard and I traded places, and he must have gotten confused. He must have saw Richard and thought it was me, and he ran this way, and I was already coming this way, and he almost ran into me. And I was only a couple feet away from him, and I fired, and blood splattered the wall, and he fell. And Richard was leaning over the cash register, I don't know why. And I turned around and said, "Let's go." Go. And he walked out the door. I walked out the door, we got in the car, and we left.
The .357 Magnum was loaded with hollow point bullets, which meant when one of the bullets had hit Robert's chest, it had caused it to split and hit his heart and his lungs. At first, Sean felt empowered by what he'd done, but was soon filled with suicidal thoughts. He went through a lot of mixed emotions, but had later come to terms with what he had done and appeared to be happy. The police had no suspects in regards to this case, and there was no CCTV, so for the time being, Sean and Richard had gotten away with murder. Sean believed that Satan had given him powers, which had given him this newfound confidence, so much so he ended up meeting a girl called Angel. They had started dating, however, after a few times of coming over, Sean's mum had disapproved of her because she skipped school and she smoked. I'm sorry, but the irony of that. Sean and his mum argued a hell of a lot because she didn't want Angel in her house, so Sean had left. He went and stayed at the abandoned farmhouse. He also got himself a job at a pizza place, but Sean had bitten off more than he could chew, and he went crawling back to his parents' house. When he got back, his mother's concerns for her son had grown so much that she had written him a 6-page letter on how much that she loved him and she'd always be there for him. But it was too late. His twisted little mind had made up his next sacrifice, and it was to be his mum. Sean attempted to take his mother's life by lacing her coffee with rat poison, and then he sat there patiently waiting for her to die. And after she took a couple of sips and nothing happened, he wondered what the hell was going on. I mean, her stomach must have been made of steel or something. Either that, or he didn't put enough in. So Sean was back to square one on how to kill his own mum. He then went on a 3-day drug bender. He smoked cannabis and took enough speed to keep him awake throughout the 3-day bender. He then went to sleep for a few hours, but when he woke, so did the demon inside him. He snuck into his parents' room, where he got his hands on his stepdad's .44 revolver. And on the 4th of March 1996, Sean had patiently waited for his parents to go to sleep, but just beforehand, he had to perform one last ritual. He needed help in this murder, as he knew that his stepdad would be the one factor that would stop him from killing his mum, which was ultimately his main target. He knew that his stepdad had served as a former Green Beret, so he needed to kill him first, but he needed help to do so he called for help from Ezerite. Once he had finished his ritual, he snuck into his parents' bedroom.
I walked up to his bed, and I pointed the gun at my father's head, and I squeezed the trigger. And I immediately lifted the gun to where I knew my mother's head was. I couldn't see it anymore because the flash had blinded me, but I knew where it was. And I squeezed the trigger again. And the blood was pouring out of a hole in my mother's face. And it was pooling with the water in the waterbed that should have been pierced by the bullet. And I remember feeling like someone had just picked this big rock above my shoulders, like all the burdens of the world had been gone from me, like relief, you know. And I laughed, I giggled hysterically.
But the realisation of what he'd done to his own parents had finally set in, and Sean started to panic and went over to Richard's house. Richard honestly thought that Sean was messing around, just saying it to try and impress him. But it dawned on him that he was actually telling the truth. But instead of doing the right thing, Richard had brought him into the house to help cover up these murders. Richard had taken the gun and hid it. He had also become Sean's alibi for that night, so if anybody came round asking any questions, them two had been together all night. The next day they went back to Sean's house, and Sean had immediately gone into the bathroom and sprinkled water onto his face to make out like he was crying. He then ran out onto the street screaming that his parents were dead. One neighbour had heard this commotion and had come out to see what was wrong, and when he had told them what he had found, the neighbour had run home and phoned the police. Once they arrived, the police thought that Sean was acting weird, not acting like somebody that had found anyone dead, let alone his parents dead. When they questioned him, he showed no emotion, he just had this blank look on his face. So they went with their gut instinct and took both Sean and Richard in for questioning. Sean thought that he would get away with it, and investigators were interviewing him for 7 hours. However, Richard had caved in almost immediately and told them everything that had gone on. Sean then had no leg to stand on and had no choice but to tell the police what he'd done to his own parents. While he was getting things off his chest, he also confessed to the murder of Robert Bower at Circle K. Sean was then charged for these murders, and so was Richard. However, he was very quick to testify against him and took a plea deal for being an accessory for after the fact for all 3 murders. I looked this up, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a deferred sentence is where you accept the charges, take the penalty, which is only a minimum, and then you have none of this on your record. I don't even get why this is even a thing. He assisted in 3 murders, one of them he was actually there for, and all he gets is 5 years of this sentence, and then after that, it all gets forgotten about. It just doesn't seem fair, especially for the families of these victims. However, Sean didn't get off so lightly, but he had pled not guilty. His defence was that it wasn't him who had committed these murders, as he had practised satanic rituals just before these murders, and it was the demon that had possessed him who had committed these murders and not him. The jury didn't believe him, and Sean Sellers was sentenced to death for his crimes. See, in 1986, Oklahoma didn't give juries the option to give a life sentence without the possibility of parole. One of the jury members had suggested that maybe giving him parole after 7 to 14 years after serving the life sentence, but many of the jury members thought that this sentence wasn't long enough, and he was sentenced to death. Sean Sellers then became the youngest inmate on Oklahoma's death row. While he was on death row, Sean had converted from Satanism to Christianity. Some of his friends had started up a website for him, believing that he deserved clemency. This was because of his conversion to God and the fact that he was only 16 years old at the time of the murders. Sean had made a couple of appearances in TV shows, also on a couple of documentaries.
I find someone who gets involved in Satanism and stuff, I find that there are reasons below that, you know. They didn't get involved in Satanism because they wanted to be a Satanist. They got involved in Satanism because maybe their father abused them, you know. Maybe they were had incest or something going on in the homes. Something was going on whenever they were children. And if you are involved in Satanism, you know, be honest with yourself. Look at your life. Look at what's going on around you. And ask yourself, why are you doing this?
On Valentine's Day 1985, Sean had even got married to a woman behind bars, but this was annulled 2 years later. Throughout the years of imprisonment, he had made many appeals. He had told the US Circuit Board that he had suffered with severe mental illness at the time of these murders. He also told them that he invited demons into his body, which told him to do things like shoot up the class and kill everybody. He went on to say, at first he thought he was cool, but after a while he started to lose touch with his emotions and his feelings, and he said he couldn't feel nothing at all. In 1992, 6 years after Sean had committed his crimes, he had been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder.
Questions about his mental health were added to the questions about his age. A religious group paid for him to be tested for a condition known as multiple personality disorder, or MPD.
And they hooked me up to this EEG machine, put all these electrodes all over my head, laid me down, mapped my brain, sent it off to the neurologist, and it came back and they said, shows different brain waves for different altered personalities. They said, Sean, you can't fake this, you have MPD, accept it, it's true. And I sat there just stunned, but then, reluctantly, I had to admit that it explained some things.
This is a disorder where a person feels like they're switching between identities. Sometimes they can feel the presence of more than one person talking or in their head. They might even feel like they are possessed by these identities, and a team of mental health professionals are determined that Sean had suffered with at least 3 different identities, and it could be up to as much as 8. In March of 1987, another psychiatrist had claimed that Sean was chronically psychotic and suffered with paranoid schizophrenia and other major mood swings. She also mentioned how out of touch he was with reality and how much he was into his fantasies. During the appeals, his attorneys had said that the person facing the death penalty was in fact not the person who committed these crimes. But just like everything back in the day, the view on mental illness was very vague. However, the prosecutor had argued that this was just his attempt to get out of his death sentence, as he'd been diagnosed with this 6 years after his sentence, believing that he could have full well manufactured this in the time that he was in prison. During the appeals, they acknowledged this new evidence, but they couldn't conclude that this would have actually changed the outcome. His appeal went so far up that it went to the Supreme Court in November of 1988, but they refused to hear Sean's final appeal. The Attorney General asked the State of Criminal Appeals to set an execution date, which they did. Some people were outraged by this, and not just for the fact that he suffered from mental illness, but the fact that he was 16 at the time of these murders. Sean had then spent the rest of his life in Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was one of the first prisoners that had moved in there in November of 1991. Sean was a model prisoner, and he had not one incident reported about him while he was in there. In his final years on death row, Sean had reportedly become very religious, taking up hobbies such as artwork and writing. He also spent time making videos on the dangers of cults, satanic practices and drugs. In 1988, all of his appeals had been rejected, and executive clemency was his last option.
Lauren, I read what you said about your daughter. I am so sorry. She has to grow up without a grandfather. It makes me want to die. It's so hard for me to be here to try to beg for my life and face with that.
Stop taking. Take the punishment.
Yeah, Tom. I don't think that being 16 years old is an excuse for what I did. And I don't think that MPD is an excuse for what I did, because there are plenty of people in the world who have MPD who didn't commit murder. I don't know why I did it, honestly. I've tried to come up with answers. I've searched my heart and tried my best to come up with the answers, and I never expected people to call me a liar whenever I did that. I know that if I die, it's not going to make a difference. But if I live, I promise you that I will spend every day of my life trying to make a difference in someone else's life. I don't think it will ever make up for what I did. I'm not so illusioned that I think that I can make up for 3 people's lives. But I have to try. I've been trying, and I have to keep on if I live.
This made no difference, and his death penalty still stood. And on the 4th of January 1999, Sean Sellers had reportedly had his last meal, which he requested Chinese food. Sean was able to make a statement, and he addressed his siblings by saying, "All the people who are hating me right now are waiting to see me die. When you wake in the morning, you aren't going to feel any different. I love you all." In his final moments before he was given the lethal injection, he sang modern Christian music. He also said quite loudly, "Here I come, Father, I'm coming home." He then turned to the warden and said, "Let's do it, Gary, let's get it on." He then sang his last words, "Set my spirit free, that I might praise thee. Set my spirit free, that I might worship thee." And 5 minutes after the drugs were injected, Sean Sellers had died. His case was a very controversial case in the public eye, as many believed that he didn't deserve to die through how young he was. Others believed that he was truly possessed by the devil, who had then forced him to kill his victims. And some believed that he just suffered with mental illness. No matter the reason, Sean Sellers had murdered 3 people and ultimately ended up killing himself too. Wow, what a case. I'd love to hear what you guys think. I mean, I'm stuck here. He was a child that suffered with mental illness, who was allegedly sexually abused and beaten most of his life. Pushed from person to person, house to house, never really having anything or anyone stable in his life. I mean, it's absolutely no excuse in any way, shape or form for what he done. But I can't help but feel if he had a little bit of more care, love and guidance, I don't think this would have ended this way. Anyway guys, that's it for today. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are down in the comment box below. But until next time, I'll see you later. Bye!